The women's quarters of Golestan Palace fell silent after midnight in the winter of 1847. Within those walls, a transformation was reaching its conclusion. Princess Zara Qajar, 16 years old and daughter of one of Persia's most powerful dynasties, was hours away from her wedding. But the terror she felt had nothing to do with the ceremony itself. What she feared was the culmination of 6 months of systematic preparation, a process so psychologically devastating that historians still debate its full impact on the young women who endured it. The Qajar dynasty ruled Persia from 1785 to 1925, presiding over an empire that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. Like many monarchies of the era, the Qajars understood that political power required not just military strength, but control over every aspect of the social order. Royal marriages were instruments of statecraft, binding military generals to the throne, securing alliances with provincial governors, and rewarding loyal administrators. The daughters of the Shah existed as political currency, their marriages arranged without their consent or input. This practice was not unique to Persia. Across Europe, the Ottoman Empire, and much of Asia, royal women served similar functions. What distinguished the Qajar court and what makes Princess Zara's story particularly significant to historians was the elaborate preparation system documented in palace records, a system designed not merely to teach etiquette but to fundamentally reshape a young woman's psychology. The preparation process began the moment an engagement was announced. For Zara, this came in the spring of 1847 when she learned she would marry Mirza Hassan Khan, a 43-year-old military commander from northern Persia. Palace records indicate he had been married twice before. Both previous wives had died, one from childbirth complications, the other from what documents vaguely termed melancholy, a catch-all diagnosis in 19th-century medical practice that could mean anything from depression to numerous other conditions. The women assigned to prepare Zara held formal titles: the overseer of brides, the mistress of ritual, the guardian of propriety. Their function, as revealed in coded documents from the Qajar archives studied by historians including Dr. Afsani Najmabadi of Harvard University, was to ensure that royal brides entered marriage in a state of complete psychological compliance. The first phase involved radical restriction of speech. Historical records indicate that young women in preparation were permitted to speak only in response to direct questions, and only using approved formal phrases. This wasn't simply about teaching proper etiquette. Linguistic research has demonstrated that language is fundamental to maintaining psychological continuity and sense of self. By restricting a young woman's vocabulary to perhaps 40 or 50 phrases of agreement, apology, and request, the system wasn't just controlling communication. It was dismantling the cognitive tools needed for complex thought and self-advocacy. Dr. Najmabadi's research into Qajar palace documents reveals that multiple young women underwent this preparation simultaneously. Rather than providing mutual support, they were deliberately positioned in competition with each other. When one girl violated the speaking protocols, all would face consequences, creating a dynamic where the young women policed each other rather than forming alliances. This pattern, isolating victims while forcing them into proximity, appears repeatedly in historical systems of psychological control. The second phase involved what palace records termed movement instruction. This went far beyond teaching graceful comportment. Young women spent hours daily practicing specific gestures of subordination, particular angles of the head, restricted hand positions, shortened stride lengths. The goal, according to documents analyzed by historians, was to train the body to express submission at an automatic level. Modern trauma research helps us understand what this accomplished. The body internalizes repeated physical patterns, creating what neuroscientists call procedural memory. By drilling these submissive movements until they became reflexive, the system was literally rewiring neural pathways. A young woman's body would begin expressing subordination before her conscious mind could even register the need to do so. The third phase, documented extensively in palace records, involved elaborate role-playing scenarios that historians term the testings. Older women would simulate the bride's future interactions with her husband. But these simulations were designed to be impossible to succeed at. No matter how correctly a young woman performed, the response would be arbitrary criticism, sudden anger, or complete social erasure where she would be treated as if she no longer existed. The testings served a specific psychological function that modern researchers recognize from studies of coercive control. By ensuring that no response led to approval, that punishment was random and disconnected from performance, the system created what psychologist Martin Seligman identified in the 1960s as learned helplessness. When organisms, including humans, are placed in situations where their actions have no reliable connection to outcomes, they eventually stop trying to control their circumstances. They internalize the belief that they are powerless. What makes the Qajar preparation system particularly devastating was its unpredictability. Palace schedules show that testings could occur at any moment, during meals, study time, or while walking through corridors. The young women lived in a state of constant vigilance, never knowing when the next scenario would begin. This chronic stress state, what we now understand as hypervigilance, has documented physiological effects: elevated heart rate, disrupted sleep patterns, heightened startle responses, and difficulty concentrating. Historical accounts from palace physicians preserved in the archives of the Golestan Palace Library describe young women experiencing what they termed nervous afflictions, inability to sleep, sudden episodes of trembling, loss of appetite, and what one document describes as a peculiar absence of spirit. These descriptions align remarkably with modern clinical understanding of trauma responses. The wedding night itself, contrary to what sensationalized accounts might suggest, was not inherently more traumatic than wedding nights throughout much of the historical world. Marriages in this era across cultures rarely involved the consent or emotional readiness of the bride. What made the Qajar system distinctive was the 6 months of psychological preparation that preceded it. By the time a young woman entered her husband's chambers, she had been systematically trained to experience her own powerlessness as normal, her own will as something that must be suppressed, her own body as something that existed for others' purposes. Historians debate the full extent of psychological damage caused by this system. Some argue that many young women eventually adapted to their circumstances and found sources of power within the constraints of palace life. Others point to the documented cases of women who never psychologically recovered, who lived in states of what palace records termed perpetual melancholy. What we know with certainty is that this system was not accidental or spontaneous. It was deliberately designed, refined over generations, and maintained because it served the dynasty's interests. Royal marriages required compliant wives who would not challenge their husbands' authority or create political complications through independent action. The Qajar preparation system ended with the dynasty itself in 1925. When Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power and initiated modernizing reforms that included changes to marriage practices and women's legal status. But the historical record of what occurred in those palace quarters remains, preserved in documents that scholars continue to study and interpret. These stories matter not because they allow us to judge the past by contemporary standards, but because they reveal how systems of control operate. The Qajar preparation system demonstrates that psychological coercion doesn't require physical violence to be devastating. It shows how isolation, unpredictability, and the systematic removal of agency can break a person's will as effectively as any weapon. Princess Zara's fate after her marriage remains unclear. Palace records from the period are incomplete, and many documents were lost or destroyed during subsequent political upheaval. What survives is evidence of the system that shaped her final months before marriage. A system that treated young women not as individuals with inherent worth, but as instruments to be calibrated for a specific function. The screaming that echoed through Golestan Palace that November night in 1847 was not an isolated incident. It was the sound of a system working exactly as designed, breaking what needed to be broken, erasing what needed to be erased, all in service of maintaining power structures that depended on the absolute control of women's bodies, minds, and futures.